So welcome everyone to Beth Tikva Women's Evening with Robert Rotenberg. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Adele Weinstein, and I am the president of Beth Tikva Women. And it's wonderful to see so many people out this evening. And Beth Tikva Women will be having other programs in the near future. One of them being a painting, a day to paint. And we're working on it, and I'll get the information out. It'll be out in the Beth Tikva emails very soon. So I'd like to thank Doris Alter, our executive director, for helping tonight, and Gail Kurtzman, our events and program coordinator. This program would not have happened tonight without their help. Thank you. And I'd like to welcome Robert Rotenberg and introduce him. Robert Rotenberg is the author of several best-selling novels, including Old City Hall, The Guilty Plea, Stray Bullets, Stranglehold, Heart of the City, and Downfall. He is a criminal lawyer in Toronto with his firm Rotenberg. Now, let's see if I can say this right. Shidlowski?
Right.
Is that right? Did I say it right? Okay, and Jessen. He is also a television screenwriter and a writing teacher. And visit him at robertrotenberg.com or follow him on Twitter at Robert Rotenberg. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Robert Rotenberg.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So I can see who's not a Maple Leafs fan, as I said before. I think what I want to do first is just give you a little bit of my background and how I ended up here. I'm a criminal lawyer, and I always say to my clients when I first meet them, I say everything in your life led up to this very moment when you're sitting here in my office. So in a funny way, everything in my life led up to this moment that I'm talking to all of you. I grew up in Toronto. My father was a physician. I was one of 4 boys, and very literary home. My mother and father were great readers. And I went to Bathurst Heights, and I came from a pretty upper middle class family, but Bathurst Heights was really a middle class school. We had kids from everywhere. And most of my Jewish friends there, or many of them, they were children of Holocaust survivors. To this day, 3 of my very best friends, including Alvin Shidlowski, my associate, are children of Holocaust survivors. So how did I end up writing books? Well, it's too long a story to tell right now, but I always had this idea I wanted to be a writer, even when I was a kid, and I never knew if it would happen. I remember when I was about 16 or 17, I wrote a story and sent it to the New Yorker magazine. And I remember they sent it back with all these comments, and I thought, you can actually do this. So I went to university. I took a lot of English courses at U of T, and I took a year off thinking I was going to be a writer. Didn't really know what I was going to do. I traveled around Europe, and I got in law school. So being a nice Jewish boy was something to fall back on, as my mother wanted. I went to law school, and I can tell you, I was a fish out of water at law school, in that I always had a great sense of criminal law. I grew up reading about criminal law. I just understood. I've always had a very natural feel for it. So basically, when I was at Osgood, I spent my whole time doing criminal law, legal aid work. I went to the London School of Economics for a year. So I have 3 degrees, and very long story short, I always wanted to write publish a magazine. So a good friend of mine, one of my best friends, Robert Sarner, had started a magazine in Paris called Passion Magazine. So I talked myself into a job, and I went to France for a year. And that's where I really learned to begin to edit. And from there, I came back to Toronto, and I started my own magazine, which was called TO Magazine. And I did that for 6 years. So they say if you want to make $1 million in the restaurant or the magazine business, start with 10 million. Well, we didn't have $10 million. So we worked all the time, and I really learned how to edit stories and to write stories. Then I spent a few years at other jobs. I worked at a film company, which I despised. I worked at CBC Radio for a year. And when I was 37 years old, I had to say to my mom, Mom, you're right. It's a good thing I have this law degree to fall back on. So I just opened a law practice. Now, fortunately, I'd known all these people at Osgood who I'd mentored. So everyone gave me work. And somehow that was 32 years ago. So the first day that I went to Scarborough Provincial Court, which is a horrible court, I came home, I thought, I can't do this, only this for the rest of my life. So I started writing a book. I spent 10 years writing the first book. So if any of you are writing novels, it takes a while. The book was good enough to get an agent in New York. A lot of people read it. They really liked it. They loved the writing, but they said the plot's kind of a cliche plot, kind of a thriller, Day of the Jackal kind of plot. But they said there was this one chapter about this small town lawyer. It was like a fantastic chapter. So, you know, they always say, write what you know. And I was determined that I was not going to be called the John Grisham of Canada. Well, here's my new book, Downfall. And what's it say? Rotenberg is the John Grisham of Canada. So, you know, you can run, but you can't hide, I guess. So it took another 10 years to write Old City Hall. And I'll tell you a cute little story. My office is in Eddie Greenspan's building. A lot of you will know who Eddie was, an extraordinary man. And he helped me a lot in law and just fun and talking. And one day he called me into his office. He said, so tell me, how long did it take to write this book? So I told him what I just told you. And he looks at me and goes, okay, I guess I won't do that. So Old City Hall came out in 2009. And I guess much to my amazement, it did extraordinarily well. Got translated in 9 languages, including Hebrew. And I've been very fortunate. So I'm now working on book 7. I still practice law full time. I've tried to get into screenwriting. I co-wrote a Murdoch mystery of Al Jolson coming to Toronto in 1905. It's called Murdoch Schmurdoch. It was a lot of fun. So I'm doing a lot of that. But I'm still practicing law. So if your crazy uncle gets arrested, you can give me a call or keep reading my books. So when I started writing the books, I really didn't know very much about murder mysteries. And I still don't. I don't read a lot of murder mysteries. But I just want to write about the city and how I see it. And I came up with this idea for a detective whose name is Ari Green. And I made him the father of a Holocaust, the son of a Holocaust survivor. Now, a lot of people write to me about this, and you're going to see something tonight. We're going to talk about this. And I think it's because I grew up next to Holocaust survivors. And my friend Sid Fox, who's a member of your congregation a few years ago, I was there. And he said, your description of his father is like my dad. And he's an amalgamation of a lot of characters. But I think growing up next to people, a lot of people who are Holocaust survivors said they couldn't have written this. But I think that they grow up with a different reality than kind of the rather coddled reality I grew up in. I like to say to Alvin, you guys have an extra gear. And I say to my friends who aren't Jewish, I say, listen, understand, they don't have uncles or aunts or cousins. Their parents were working class. And it's not always a great story. It's a difficult story, but I just find it fascinating. And for those of you who followed the series, I don't want to give away too much, but the next book, I'm actually digging back into the past of these characters. I've been reading a lot lately about, I read a book a while ago called The Brigade, about the Jewish brigade that fought in World War II in 1944 and 45. And been reading a lot about the origins of Israel and what happened after World War II. And here I want to take I'm going to tell you a little secret. I have this idea for a TV series set in a DP camp, a displaced person camp, where Ari Green's father is kind of a pseudo detective. It's a world, the whole displaced person camp from 45 to 48 that really hasn't been explored enough. And it's a pretty extraordinary world. So that's kind of my intro. So to kind of bring it full circle, I mentioned my friend Robert Sarner, who I went to work for in Paris. Well, Robert's moved back to Toronto. His wife, Galia's Food, makes the most amazing Israeli food. I'll give a little promo for Galia. Robert's one of my best friends. I just saw him yesterday. And he wrote an article about me in the Israeli Times, where he's a journalist. So it's kind of everything kind of comes full circle. So that's a good start. Now I want people to, oh, someone saw the episode. They liked it on Murdoch. I want to get a lot of questions, and I know people can be a bit shy about asking questions, but let's get one or two questions, and then we're gonna get into the book a little bit. Any questions out there? Oh, I hear the sounds of silence. Okay, one of the things that I've found is all this online stuff is it's very boring sitting just having an author read his books. And now in the online world, everyone's a photographer and everyone's got a movie camera. So to start, what I've done is I've asked a few different people to read parts of my book. When I was at University of Toronto, I had this wonderful professor, Professor Chamberlain. He was kind of my favorite. And one of the joys of getting a book published is people from your past kind of show up. So he's become, I'm very honored to say he's a big fan of my books. So I've asked him to start tonight. And all of these readings, by the way, are on my website. In fact, I'm encouraging my readers to do little readings. So I've asked a number of people to do short readings. So this is the opening of the book. Now, my theory about the opening of a book is you have to accomplish 5 different things. You have to establish a character. You have to establish a setting. You have to establish some kind of action. You have to establish some kind of interest or tension, and maybe even some suspense. But most of all, you have to establish the voice of a character, and you have to care about what's going to happen. So I want you to listen very closely to the first paragraph or two. And we're going to have our first reading tonight from Professor Chamberlain. So it's just going to be the opening of Downfall. And Gail, we'll see if we can be a technical wizard. We'll see if we can get this to go. Here we go.
Because the subways in Toronto didn't run early enough in the morning, Jemba Roshan had no choice but to ride his bicycle to work. His wife, Babita, was not pleased. In Canada, it is dark in November, and you don't even have a light, she'd said when he was getting dressed to leave. She was right, of course, but what else could he do? They needed to buy diapers for the twins, and the rent on their 1-bedroom apartment was due in a week. I promise that I'll be careful, he told her as he was rushing out the door, but she'd refused to kiss him goodbye. In 7 years of marriage, she'd never done that before. A week earlier, the weather had turned from breezy fall temperatures to freezing cold. Yesterday, there'd even been a heavy early snowfall that had blanketed the city and closed the airport. Last winter, when he felt this kind of chill for the first time, Roshan had rushed out to the Variety Village at the nearby plaza and bought a used ski jacket. It wasn't warm enough. And now he wore as many layers underneath it as he could. He didn't have gloves, and as he began his 30-minute ride, his hands stiffened on the icy bicycle handlebars. He pedaled hard. This would get his heart rate up and the blood flowing to his fingers. He'd bought the bicycle at a yard sale for $20. The man wanted $30. Stripped it down and rebuilt it from the ball bearings up. Roshan liked to joke with his Somali friends that it was the only engineering work he'd done since coming to Canada. It was quiet on the streets of the public housing complex where they lived, but once he got to the main road, the traffic picked up. This was the most treacherous part of his route, with noisy transport trucks whizzing past, leaving little space for a man on a bicycle, the acrid smell of their exhaust filling his nostrils. There were streetlights, but they were wide apart. He kept riding from light to dark and back into the light, the white steam of his breath appearing and disappearing in front of his face like some kind of magic act at the circus. Since his jacket was black, Babita had used her sewing machine to make him a special white t-shirt with reflecting tape sewn onto it. She insisted that he wear it on top of his jacket to make himself more visible, but in his haste this morning and after their fight, he'd forgotten it. She would be angry with him about that when he got home.
So that's the opening. I won't tell you what happens to our intrepid bicycle rider. But that's what I try to do with an opening, is to really get people into the book. A lot of writers think that you always have to start with the main character. I rarely do. In fact, usually I start with some very minor character, some character who shows a different part of the city. The first book opens with an Indian gentleman who delivers newspapers at 6:30 in the morning. The second book opens with a Filipino nanny who's on the way to a very wealthy family's home. Third book opens with a guy who works at a Tim Hortons, who under an assumed name, who's an illegal immigrant to Canada from Portugal. It's my way, I'm not quite sure. First of all, I think it's a great way to get into a story. And secondly, it's also a great way to show the city, to show a lot of different parts of the city. When I sold the books, I asked the publisher at Simon Schuster, well, what was it about Old City Hall? And he said, Bobby, you talk about the people we don't see. And I've always remembered that. I've always thought that as a really terrific compliment. Okay, I'm gonna look at the.
I was going to say, you do have a question.
Okay, let's get a question here.
All right, so Margot asks, do you write full-time now or still practice law? Morley Torgov told me once he wrote because he found law boring. Maybe a joke, but how did you find the time?
Yeah, well, Morley was one of my inspirations. Yes, I practice full-time and I write full-time. And, you know, people always ask me, how do you find the time? So I came up with a new line recently. I said, well, if you play golf, that's like 10, 15 hours a week. So if you don't play golf, you got lots of time to write a book. John Grisham once said, if you write a page a day, after a year, you've written a book. So I just make the time. It goes in phases. You can see I'm not in my office. I'm actually up at a cabin. So I tend to take a lot of time off in the summer and really isolate myself. And I get a lot more writing done then. I just read a great quote from Pablo Picasso. He said, nothing great has ever been done for people who don't have solitude. Because it's it's very nice to have all you people listening to me today, but it's a very solitary and it's not a fun thing to do to write a book. It's great when it works, but you really have to take time to yourself. So what I try to do is I always have a story going in my head. Like this morning, I finished a chapter and I've already thought of the next chapter. So I can't wait like tomorrow morning to just get that down. Scott Fitzgerald said there's no writers, it's just rewriters. And I rewrite everything I do, every chapter, every word, every paragraph 30, 40, 50 times.
Yeah, there's another question.
Yep.
I really like the city of Toronto. Is like a real character in the book. Did you intend that?
Absolutely. I think location is really, really key. And, you know, I grew up in Toronto and it was such a boring city. As my mother said, they couldn't wait to get out of Toronto, but they couldn't after the war. But I still have vague memories of my parents complaining because the streetcars stopped. And I remember once on Sundays, going to a baseball game with my dad and we had to come home early. And if you wanted to go to a liquor store, you had to write it out on a piece of paper. And I remember the very first time we went to a Japanese restaurant at sushi and it was shocking. And now when I say to my 22-year-old daughter, oh, I grew up in Toronto, there was no sushi. She said, like, how could you live without sushi? So Toronto is a city in transition, and it's also a city that's a safe haven. As a criminal lawyer, it's given me a great lens into the life of people from everywhere in the world you can imagine. And so many of them are like Holocaust survivors, whether they're Vietnamese survivors or from Africa or from really everywhere. And they've come here. I think we take for granted how peaceful a city we live in. Not just that we don't have the guns of the Americans, but also how well people get along. And but it's a city in transition. And all good drama is conflict. It's a city of conflict. We have all these shootings now. When I started practicing law 32 years ago, it was very, very rare to have a gun case. Now, it's not just the murder rate, but the level of violence and the level of homelessness, which is the theme of the new book, and yet the wealth. I mean, a lot of you are my age or older. I don't remember seeing this incredible wealth that we see in Toronto. The cars, the houses, the restaurants. And when I was a kid, my mother would say Sunday nights, the dining room is closed. So what could we do? We could go for Chinese, we could go for roast beef. And if we really got exotic, we went to La Chaumière and had French food. That's probably why I ended up living in France. So you don't get one without the other. I want to play the second clip. I talked a bit about Ari's father and the relationship between he and his father has really touched people. And I get emails from people all around the world. It's very, very touching. And often they start by saying, I'm not Jewish, but this reminded me of something with my father or my mother. So one of the great things about writing a series is that you know something about, I was going to say your clients, about your characters that they don't know. So bit of a spoiler alert to get this, but Ari finds out at some point in the series, I won't say when, that he has a 22-year-old daughter. 20-year-old daughter he didn't know about. And her name is Allison, and she didn't know he existed, and she didn't know that she was half Jewish. So she ends up coming from England to live in Toronto. And she's a great lens for me because I can get her to talk about Toronto, kind of seeing it in a different way, just as I had Roshan and all these other characters look at a different way. But she develops this extraordinary relationship with her grandfather. And so this scene you're going to see read now is read by one of my readers. Now, this is a reader of mine who lives in Germany. And she's gotten in touch with me. And it's a funny thing, she told me she's a great hockey fan, but she's a great fan of the books. So I asked her to read this part of the book. So I think I'll say no more. I'll let it speak for itself. Gail, do your magic if you can.
Hello, good evening to Toronto. My name is Catherine. I live in Ulm, Germany, and I'm a big fan of the Ari Green series. My favorite book so far is Stranglehold, and now I'm really looking forward to reading Downfall. So let's start with the short part of it. Alison adored her grandfather from the moment they met at the airport, the day she arrived in Canada with her father. She soon nicknamed him Grandpa Y. His wife had died a few years earlier, and Ari was their only child. Ari's surprise discovery of Alison, his unknown daughter in England, meant that for the first time in his life, Grandpa Y had a grandchild. She couldn't even begin to imagine the horrors he'd been through in his long life. He'd grown up in a small town in central Poland. Half of the 4,000 people who lived there were Catholic, the other half were Jewish. The two groups got along without incident for centuries, until the night in September 1942, when the Nazis arrived. Grandpa Y's first wife and 2 children were murdered, along with all the other 2,000 Jews. Only Yitzhak and 1 other man survived. In 1945, when the American 82nd Airborne liberated the concentration camp he was in, he weighed 85 pounds. After 3 years in a displaced persons camp in Austria, where he met Ari's mother, they arrived in Canada virtually penniless. Despite all this, Grandpa Y was the most positive and wisest person she'd ever met. And then they had a discussion that ends with, she had one more question, the toughest one. Grandpa Y was still holding her hand. The answer is yes, he said before she could speak. Your father loved your mother. I know she loved him. You never have to worry about that. She hadn't cried since her mother died. Now she couldn't stop. Grandpa Y waited patiently. Her parents loved each other. She was conceived in love. She wasn't sure why it meant so much to her, but it did. She got up and bent over to kiss his cheek. He pulled her close for another one of his hugs. This one was tighter than ever. The Nazis took them all away from me, he whispered, his lips close to her ear. Then God gave me you.
Well, there you have it. Why don't we get a few questions? I see there are quite a few, actually. One of the questions I saw already was someone said, how do you handle rejection? I spent 10 years sending books out, and that was before the internet. So I used to have to go down and spend 60, I still remember, it cost $64 to print the book out and send it by courier to New York. And I got all sorts of rejections. And I've actually, one of the reasons why I took a few years off publishing is because I had an idea for a new book, and I spent 2 years writing a totally different book, totally different characters. And finally, my publisher said to me, Bobby, it's just not working. So maybe it's because I was an editor for so long, but rejection is just part of it. And if you really want to write a book, I have two suggestions. Don't try to write a book you think's going to sell. Just write the book you want to write. I didn't have any template. In fact, I broke a lot of the rules for murder mysteries. In fact, I don't really like when people classify things as genre and not genre. I just wrote the book of the world that I want to write about. So maybe that's a good answer. Are there any more questions? Can we get some more questions?
Sure. Okay, what is your favorite book?
What was my favorite what?
Book.
I get asked that question all the time. I don't know. I don't have, it's usually the last book that I read. So, you know, I think, you know, Duke Ellington said there's only two kinds of writing, good writing or bad writing. And I think the one thing that I've learned over all these years is that I just seek out things that are well written, whether it's baseball almanac, I'm a baseball nut, about baseball teams, or whether it's reading in the magazine or a newspaper or a book. I don't have one particular favorite book, I don't think. I don't just read murder mysteries. In fact, I hadn't really read many murder mysteries before I wrote this book. Any more?
Oh, sure. Okay, so why did you pick the character who was the only Jewish detective?
Okay, well, that's a great story because I just came up with the idea. I just thought it's the world I know. I'm very close friends with a few detectives. One in particular, his name's Tom Klatt, who helps me a lot. We work on cases together, and whenever I'm writing something, he's always helping me with ideas. And I knew that there was one Jewish detective on the force named Mark Mendelson. Now I knew of him, and I just thought, I was determined that whatever happened, I didn't want to meet him until I was writing Old City Hall at the time. Well, then our firm got involved in a very big, very high profile murder case. And Alvin Shidlowski, my associate, ended up going down to Jamaica with Mark Mendelson as part of this case. It was a very famous case. And I kept saying to Alvin, don't tell me anything about Mark. I don't want to see him. I don't want to, and he would come to the office, I would hide. So eventually the book came out, and a few books came out. And then eventually I moved into Eddie Greenspan's office building. And then one day, Mark Mendelson showed up. So, and in fact, when we did the book launch on February 2nd, who interviewed me? Mark Mendelson. So I don't know, authors always say this, you don't really choose characters, you come up with all sorts of characters. And then I didn't really know he would become kind of the main character. My books are much more of an ensemble cast than most lawyers' books. He just seemed to appeal to me as a really complex. I mean, I think what you need for your main characters is someone who's complex. He's very Canadian because he's not an alcoholic. He's not, I really can't stand these kind of cliche American detectives who are all former alcoholics, former drug addicts, and were abused as kids or whatever, and they're revengeful. But he has a sense of loyalty and he has a sense of justice about him. If we had time, I picked out a passage to read. It was interesting when my friend Robert Sarner was interviewing me, and we put aside being friends. He just interviewed me as an interviewer for this article. I found myself saying, Ari Green's is kind of like a rabbi, because he's thoughtful and he listens to people. He's a very quiet character. It's very hard to write a quiet character. And he's respectful of everyone. And I guess that's what I like about him. That's what people like about him. But he's not perfect. That's important too. Somebody asked if I tour around the city. When I do a lot of walking. And any place I write about, in the first book, I have a scene at Grice Bagels, which I'm sure a lot of you know. And I went there when I went to Ledbury all the time. And I went back there and there were these little notes on the sideboard. And those are exactly replicated in the book. So any place that I talk about, I go to, even if it's not in Toronto, some of the scenes. And I spend a lot of time walking around. I find that's the best way to research things. One of my books, the last book, Heart of the City, was set in Kensington Market. Now, we've all been to Kensington Market a lot, but I spent days and days just walking around and just thinking about what it would be, what it's like there. And often you'll write a chapter that's, and this is what I teach all my students, you'll write a chapter that's 10 pages long, you write a description of a street that's 12, 13 paragraphs, and in the end, in the book, it might end up as 1 or 2 paragraphs. And that's good writing, where you can distill and distill. And that's where I think being a lawyer and being a writer overlaps, because the essence of being a good lawyer is being able to tell a story, being to tell a story with characters and action and suspense and sympathy, and also being precise. So we're going to play one more clip. This one, I think this is the next one lined up. This one's kind of fun. Gail? Let's see if we can get this going.
To me personally, Yitzhak,
Oh, keep that going. Keep that going, Gail, because her comments are very nice.
Simply have to adore. Thank you.
The night air was cold, the wind coming up from the valley below. Allison started to shake. Burns jumped down and put his arm around her. I didn't expect to see so many women there tonight, Allison said.
36% of the homeless are women. Do you have any idea how many homeless people there are out in the cold in this city every night? She shook her head. Even though he had his arm around her, she was still shivering. Take a guess.
She held her hands up. A few thousand?
Estimates go from 7,500 to 10,000. The average lifespan for people in this city is 82 years. Want to guess what it is for homeless people?
Not really.
Half. Think of 10,000 people dying on average at age 41. He turned and looked at the shimmering view before them. All those cranes throwing up condos for the rich, and so many people without any home at all.
This hurts you, doesn't it? She
What?
said.
What?
Seeing people suffer and dying so young. Allison wasn't quite sure how what happened between them next had happened, but she let her head drop onto his shoulder and her lips lightly touched his neck. He held her closer. What little noise there was from the traffic below seemed to disappear. And then they kissed.
That's all the section.
And that's the
Rotenberg book. That's it.
Cheers, everybody. Yay, Bobby
We'd have been
Rotenberg.
prepared to do more, but that wasn't in the script. I mean,
I
so-
asked him for a sex part to read, but
This
I
is what we
only
got.
got a kiss.
Exactly. Anyway,
Cheers.
good luck, Bobby.
Good luck,
You're the
Bobby.
best.
Well, that was a lot of fun. But you could actually see when, and if any of you aren't from Toronto, that's our mayor, John Tory. You could see he didn't really know what he was going to be reading before I sent it to him. But you could see that he was very affected by that. And so the book, I haven't really talked about the book. The book is called Downfall. I'm not big into promoting books, but it's about a number of things, but mostly it's about what I did is I set the book in, the books are set in all different parts of Toronto. This one is set in the West End, in the Humber Valley, where there's a very wealthy old golf course. And I did a reading at one of these golf courses a while ago, and you walk in and you feel like you're in the 1920s. I mean, with the wood paneling and the high ceilings, and everybody looks like they've been there. You know, there's very, very white, very stodgy. And so what I did is I put a homeless encampment right next to it. And writers talk about show, don't tell. Well, that I think is a great example of just showing the contrast in the city between the ultra rich and privileged and the ultra poor. And then these being murder mysteries, someone starts killing homeless people. So, but along with that, there's a second plot that, even though the plot about the homelessness has gotten a lot of press, I find the second plot just as compelling. One of my continuing characters, her name is Nancy Parrish. She's a very successful lawyer in her late 30s, kind of dealing with her personal life's a disaster, but her lawyer's life is very successful. Now, I know that sounds like kind of a cliche character, but trust me, she's a lot more complex than that. So she has two best friends who she met, who she went to law school with. They articled together. And then they were 3 of only 15 articling students at a big firm. So they really bonded. They called themselves the Three Amigas. And then their lives have gone in very, very different directions. And I don't want to spoil it for you, but you know, I'm at the age now when I look back at the people I grew up with, and some who had much more privilege and wealth and advantages than I did, their lives have been a total disaster. And other people who've done extraordinarily well. And I'm not just talking about financially, I'm talking about personally too. So in this one, we have the 3 women, and one's life goes up, Nancy's in the middle, and one life falls off the cliff. And I think in a way, that's an analogy for Toronto too. I think every book needs a theme. And for those of you who've read the book, there's a line in the book near the end. There's a character named Dent, who's a continuing character in the books. He's a former, very, very successful bond trader who's ended up homeless. Very smart guy. He's kind of Ari Green's alter ego, or at least man on the street sometimes. And at one point near the end of the book, he looks out at the city and he says, Ari, this used to be a really soft place, and now it's become a really hard place. And in many ways, that's the theme of the book, not just the homelessness, but also, you know, I mean, I have 3 kids in their 20s, and fortunately, they're doing really well right now, but I see their friends, I see it's not an easy city to live in. It's a great city to live in. In fact, when I grew up, all we wanted to do was live in New York or Paris or London, but I think it's the destination city for people. So there you have it. Let's get some questions.
Okay, we have another question from Fidel. Do you take ideas for your books from any of your legal clients?
That's the one thing I can tell you definitively I do not do. I mean, I feel I have a legal and moral obligation not to. So I none of this stuff in the books comes out of the cases that I do. Sometimes the characters are an amalgam of different the judges I have a lot of fun with. They're kind of an amalgam of different judges, and even Nancy Parrish is kind of a, I know a number of lawyers who kind of could fit that bill. But in terms of the actual crimes, no, I would never go close to them. I mean, the only thing is you learn it. My father was a physician. I said to him once, when I was researching a murder case, I said, I spent about 2 days in the library finding out about petechiae glands, which is the glands in your neck when you're strangled, and bruise marks and stuff. And I learned all about it. And I said to him, medicine's not that hard. You just got to read all these books. He said, yeah, no, medicine's not hard. So, but that's a good question. But that's a very, I don't give many definitive answers, but that's a very definitive answer.
Here's another question from, this is from Frida. Is there any order to your books, or are they independent of each other? What about anti-Semitism? Do any of your books deal with this issue, or even with Israel?
Well, that's, as a lawyer say, that's a lot of questions. And I write the books intentionally so that they stand alone, because fortunately, a lot of people discover one book and then they go back. But it's clearly best if you start from the first book and read them through, because there's progressive things in the books. No, I haven't really dealt with anti-Semitism or Israel in the books. I don't know if I will or not. It just hasn't, I don't know. I just haven't. It hasn't kind of come up yet. Now, of course, the world changed this last year, so we'll see. Well, having said that, well, you'll see. I mean, first of all, Ari's father's story. About 10 years ago, I got an email from a distant relative. My grandparents, the Rotenbergs, were from a town called Ivansk in Poland. And there were 4,000 Jews in Ivansk, 4,000 Poles in Ivansk, 2,000 Catholics, 2,000 Jews. And maybe many of you know, but the Nazis went from town to town in 1942, and basically only 2 people survived. They took everyone out, sent them to Treblinka, and destroyed all the cemeteries. Well, I went back to that town with a number of family members from all over the world, and we reconstituted the cemetery. And I don't want to get too much into that right now, but a lot of that really affected me, and a lot of that's been part of Ari's father's story and writing. And I've also been reading a lot about, well, you'll see when the next book, because there's a lot of the next book deals with the remnants of World War II. I'm being a bit cagey here. I'm unabashedly a Jewish writer. I mean, I didn't change my name. I mean, I don't make any apologies for having Jewish characters. I mean, that's just who I am. That's what I want to write about. Do we have any more questions? Just
Any more questions? Okay.
just so you know, that the woman in Germany, she did read Downfall, and I just found it really touching that a young woman, and unfortunately we kind of cut out her comments, but I just found it very touching that for a young woman in Germany to be so touched by this. And a very interesting thing that's happening now is that, this is part of what I've been reading a lot about, is that the second and third generation of Germans, kids who are finding out what their parents and grandparents did, are going back to Italy where there was slaughter of civilians, or they're going to Israel. It's a very complicated emotional journey. It's fascinating and it's important. It's really important. And it's something I really want to explore and write about. I mean, I think, I'll tell you a secret. I always say to people, did you figure out who did it? But really the plot is the least important thing in the books. I want to do 3 things with the book. I like to say they're airplane reading for smart people. So I say to people, did you laugh? Did you cry? Did the pages turn? And it's my Jewish sense of humor. Mostly I say, did you laugh? Because I make sure there's always something to laugh about in the books. But really the books aren't about, if it's just a who done it, it's boring. It's very, very boring. I mean, you can even see from the very opening where I've got this Somali immigrant who's forced to ride his bicycle to work. that tells you a lot about the city. I just got a very good review by someone who just, I don't like talking about my reviews, but what I liked is he said, I'm not afraid to take on the tough and the hard issues. I wrote a book called Stray Bullets, and that came out of the horrible Boxing Day shooting when Jane Kriba was killed. And that was just about gunplay in the city. I wrote a book called Stranglehold about a crazy mayor, and we may remember who our last mayor was. The last book is all about the condo building craze and people being displaced by it. And I want to be really clear about something. I'm not an advocate. I'm not saying condos are good or bad. I'm not saying guns are good. Well, I'm not saying guns are good. I'm not saying I'm not saying homelessness is good or bad, or there's a simple solution. Maybe that comes from both being a writer and being a lawyer, but I think it's more, I just want to shine a spotlight on things that people aren't talking about. And you have to do it about 2 years in advance. I mean, I wrote what I'm writing on about now won't be read for at least a year or two. So you have to kind of try to see ahead a little bit. It's funny since we don't have a live audience, it's a bit difficult. So let's get a few more questions.
How long
Any more?
did it take you? I was going to say, how long did it take you to write Downfall?
Downfall took about 2 or 3 years because I was kind of distracted with some other things. But I wrote 4 books in 5 years when I started, and that was an exhausting pace. And then I got involved with TV writing and that other book that didn't work. And so Downfall, I kind of got off track a little bit, to be candid. And then my publisher sat down with me and said, you got to just focus. So the actual really hardcore writing took about a year. But the new book I'm writing, my deadline's the end of June. So I don't think I'll make June, but hopefully the end of July. My goal now is to start writing 1 book a year, because I realize to really develop an audience and the people I'm competing against, I didn't know about mystery readers, but they're obsessive. Like half the emails I get saying, well, when's the next one? When's the next one? So, you spend a year writing a book and someone spends 1 night reading it and saying, you kept me up all night, then you've done your job.
We have a question from Tom.
Yeah.
Your books must have some moral or ethical point of view. Is this so? And can you articulate this?
Tom, that's a great question, because I think these books are moral tales. The English writer, oh my goodness, I'm forgetting her name. She just passed away. She had a great line about how murder mysteries are, people read them because they want to know there's a moral order in the world. So I read a great critique of Sherlock Holmes a while ago, saying, well, why Sherlock Holmes, Raymond Chandler, why are those books so sustaining? And it's because they're not just, oh, you solved the murder, you solved the mystery. There does have to be a moral code to the books. And if you read the books, my books what's not easy about them is they're very complex. And sometimes you don't even know exactly if the person was innocent or guilty. And I don't think that's really the bigger question. So what I like to say to writers who I work with is think of being 3 circles when you write. The first circle is the action. So in my books, someone seems to die in the first chapter, usually. Okay, so that's the action, and the action of that, which is the investigation, the trial, all of that. The second circle is the lives of those people. How do being a criminal lawyer is like, and I've done many, many murder trials. That's the life I write about. It's like being an emergency doctor. Every second is under stress. Every mistake you make could be fatal. And so how do you live that life and also have a social life, have a married life, have a relationship with your children or whatever? And then the third circle is the world around you. So whether it's the homeless situation or the gunplay or what's really happening in the city. And in in TV screenwriting, they talk about the A plot, the B plot, the C plot. I think that's a bit simplistic, but you really need to have all three of those. And to me, the great thing about writing a series is the characters and the change in the characters. And as the characters find out more about themselves, more about their past, their grandparents' past, and also the choices they make. So to me, it's always a moral story. At the end of Stranglehold, I don't want to give it away, but if you ever read the book Stranglehold, you'll see at the very end, Ari Green has a confrontation with someone. And in many ways, it's kind of like that Humphrey Bogart scene in Casablanca when he has to make the decision. And you always want your character to make the moral decision that's against their best personal interest. I've been watching a fun series called Younger, Younger. It's quite fun, and I won't get into it, but I watch it with one of my sons, and I say, they always put her in a situation where she can do something really bad to advance her career, and then she never does. And I say to him, okay, well, they've set up her moral dilemma. And then in the last series, she starts doing she makes some really bad choices. And I said to him, I don't like her anymore. And then you see that she has to resurrect herself again, which is exactly what good writing is. You know? How are we doing for time? I guess. Hey, can someone tell us what's the score in a hockey game?
We're losing.
Shelley would like to know, where did you teach?
I teach at the Humber. Well, when I was trying to get into writing, I went to the Humber Writing School, which is a 9-day course. David Besmoges, who some of you might know, was my teacher, thank goodness. Then I took something called the correspondence course at Humber with Michelle Berry. And she wrote to me one day about Old City Hall. She said, this isn't bad, you might get it published one day. So when I got it published, I bought her a copy. So that's where I teach. I usually only take one student a semester because I'm very intense with them. And then people hire me privately. If you want to hire me, maybe after July. So I'm a very demanding teacher, but I'm very nice. But I think too many people take writing courses where they just sit around and they all read each other's stuff. I'm very, very detailed. You know, I mean, I want to reread to you the very first sentence of Downfall, because what I always say is the first sentence has to establish so much. A first sentence should have contrast, should have conflict between, it should start in one direction and pivot and go somewhere else. And it should make you want to read the next sentence, want to make you care. So I'm going to reread the first sentence to Downfall. Because the subways in Toronto didn't run early enough, Jember Roshan had no choice but to ride his bicycle to work. So hopefully that makes you want to read the rest of the paragraph. You know, in the show Younger, she's working at a book publishing company. And at one point she goes into the slush pile, which is all the manuscripts no one's reading. And her friend says, oh, the slush pile, they're always horrible. You read the first paragraph and you throw it away. So of course they read 4 or 5 first paragraphs and they're terrible and they throw the books away. So I say to people, you can spend 5 years writing a book, but if your first word, your first sentence, your first paragraph, your first chapter isn't great, forget it. I later learned that when I sold Old City Hall, that one of the top editors in New York said to my agent, said, that's one of the best first chapters I've ever read. So I guess I'll pat myself on the back a bit for that. But that only took, you know, years and years to write. How are we doing for time? I guess we're just about out. Looks like we've got a few more questions.
Yeah, we do. Hold on a second. Just a second. Okay, this is from Gail. Okay. If you could give your younger self or even your children advice, would you tell them to go into law or follow their passion as an author? Well,
I tell them not to write books because it's way too difficult. my oldest son and my daughter-in-law is a lawyer, but I encouraged him not to go to law. And he sells software to government and he's doing great. I have a passion for law in terms of defending people and helping people. And now mostly I do a lot of work with victims and I do a lot of work with kind of broken families. I hardly do any trials because I try to settle everything. But I was never someone who, my whole life was the law. This book is dedicated to my friend Justice Marvin Kurz and his wife, Dr. Cynthia Lazar. And Marvin, who's I've known since grade 13, he's an extraordinary judge, and really law means everything to him. And I think my advice to them would be to follow your passion, but also listen to my mother and be practical. So my middle son is an extraordinary musician, and he also works for a food company, Havana. That's a great food company that I've actually involved with. And I think he's had to learn that if his music career works, great, but if it doesn't, he does, like me, have something to fall back on. But I think more what I would say to them is that life is not, unless you're someone like Justice Kurz, who's really, his life is law, like Eddie Greenspan, it's a wonderful thing. You can live many lives, and you can live many lives at the same time. You know, people always ask me, how do you write books and be a lawyer? And I don't think it's so extraordinary, because there's a lot of great writers who've written, who had full-time careers and have done much more than me. I guess I would say to them, follow your passion.
Okay, we'll have one more
You have a
question.
job.
How is writing for TV different than writing for books?
You know, it's very frustrating because I've come so close to having deals to make my books into TV series, and it's all written, it's all committees, and writing for TV is a collaborative effort. Writing by yourself is a very lonely job. So I've just finished co-writing a whole new TV idea with one of my oldest friends, and we've just actually sent it out, and we spent a few years writing it, and it's been a lot of fun because we're working together. But the freedom you have as an author, I mean, if I want someone to jump off a train, they just jump off a train. Whereas a producer will say, oh, it's too expensive, they can't jump off a train. But the main difference is that TV film, it's all dialogue. So there's no internal voice. You can't say Detective Green wondered, or he thought, or he remembered. It's all dialogue. What's good about it, and I work extremely hard on my dialogue, but I think it's a great discipline, but it's not easy. And writers who think, oh, I could just write a TV script, I think they're fooling themselves. It's just like I hear authors sometimes say, oh, well, if I really want to make $1 million, I just write a murder mystery. It's so easy. Well, to which I say, go at it. It's not so easy, but nothing that's good is going to be easy. So, well, listen, this has been a lot of fun, even though I wish I could hear you guys talk more. Do we have any more questions? I'm not in a big rush.
Any other questions?
Sounds like Toronto might be winning too.
No, Gail is nodding her head no.
I don't expect them to win, you know.
All right, well.
I just want them to win for my son's sake, that's all.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Robert. This has been a very enjoyable evening and very informative. And it's been wonderful having you. And I know I've had a good time, and I've read some of your books. So thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Well, thanks a lot. It's been a lot of fun. So I'll do the 2-second promo, robertrotenberg.com, subscribe, buy the books, tell your friends. And most of all, just enjoy the books. That's the most important thing.